Wow, those were those were some pretty loud snaps. I gotta admit. Remember, if you like the videos, like, sub, silly comment, share, support the channel if you can. I appreciate it. Thanks. Super chat, PayPal, Patreon. I'll wait a second. I waited 2 seconds. Remember, if you like the videos, yeah, right? If you want to support the channel, like it, subscribe, super chat it, whatever. That does help the channel. I appreciate it. Today, I want to talk about something that I would do if I was changing Street Fighter, and that is changing the way that Ryu's fireball works. Just a little bit. Just a little bit. And this is this is something I don't think I've actually ever seen anyone talk about. So this is perhaps a obscure change because of that, but this is definitely something that I would fiddle with trying to get this to work if I was changing Street Fighter or making my own Street Fighter. So I got some video examples, but let's first look at the image of what I'm going to be talking about here. So if we're talking about Super Turbo, old school Street Fighter, Ryu, remember, and I show the blue fireball here, but it's the red fireball as well. Remember that Ryu, during this portion, and this portion of the fireball, Ryu's fireball, if it's the red fireball, it knocks down, right? We understand that, right? But what I want to focus on is actually just this part right here, where it has the shield, because you might not know this, right? But despite the fireball looking like a shield right here, if we look at this right here, right, the actual hitbox of the fireball is actually only just a smidge bigger, right? Now I would change this, right? And I want you to remember though, this is only going to be for 3 frames, because this portion of the fireball right here, the shield part, only hits for 3 frames, even though the actual knockdown part of it, I think it's like 2, 3, 3 maybe, right? Again, I'm not big fireballs, but it hits around 7 or 8 frames. It can knock you down, right? So also remember, when we're talking about if I was making my own Street Fighter, although it might sound archaic, if we're thinking about Super Turbo, remember Ryu, when he does a little kick or a medium kick, right? He gets this sort of anti-air kick, right? If I'm making Street Fighter, right, even though I think it's fun to be able to poke a little bit with Ryu, like say having a far standing short that looks like this, or the stand medium kick that looks like this, I would probably not put this in a game for regular Ryu, because every character needs to be able to attack you differently, right? And I want to keep Ryu as the character that checks you, right? Ryu doesn't get to poke you in the same way as other characters, because that homogenizes the game. So even though I do think it's fun to be able to poke like that, and although you might think that this is a archaic way of a game being, not every character should play the same, okay? So I wouldn't have this sort of stuff for a regular Ryu. Would I give Ryu a hop kick to be able to augment his style a little bit? Yeah, I'd probably give Ryu a hop kick a little bit, but we're really focusing on Ryu being a checking character, right? And like I said before, I've made videos before. Why is the duck short important? Because let's say if a character like Vega does a slide, remember Ryu, if he does a Dragon Punch doesn't actually hit the slide, right? Because the hurt box on the Dragon Punch won't hit Vega, right? However, although we know, of course, that's why you have short, because short is to check moves that a Dragon Punch can't hit. However, what if we made the red fireball and the fireball, the shield actually hit like a shield? And that's why we're going to show some video examples of this, right? So we have the shield right here. Obviously, the fireball, the shield part doesn't actually hit Vega. So in these sort of circumstances, what happens is you'll generally trade, right? However, what if the red fireball actually had the hurt box that it looks like it does? But only, again, for these few frames here. It wouldn't be for this frame, this thing right here. It's only for this thing right here, right? So this would allow us to actually red fireball as a checking tool a little bit more effectively, right? Just like for a character like Zangief, although this might be the most perhaps nuanced example that might need some fiddling, which maybe perhaps this wouldn't work. If we're looking at a character like Zangief, right? If we do the fireball, right, it goes through him, right? However, what if for these very few frames, right, Although the top part of the hitbox isn't going to hit Zangief, right? We see this, right? Guess what? This would hit the lariat then, because that hits his knee. Now, you might think that might be too powerful, and that is something that might need to be tested. But remember, I'm showing examples of characters that if we're thinking about in Super Turbo, these are characters that generally you would think that Ryu loses to, right? Even if we're talking about a character like Dalsum, right? Well, this would mean that the red fireball now actually hits, or even the blue fireball for these few frames here. This would mean that this hits Dalsum's slide. Now, perhaps when you're balancing the game, you know, newer games do have just projectile invincibility. So you could say that, oh, well, maybe the fireball can't hit Dalsum's roundhouse slide. But if you do the little kick slide, right? Little kick slide has some projectile invincibility, right? Something you might be able to do. But remember, we have this upper part here. So you might think, okay, Clayton, we're saying that Ryu Dalsum can't slide under a fireball as much, right? But what about that this move hits more up? Would this actually affect Dalsum doing a drill? Because that's one of the more annoying things, because Dalsum can react drill to fireballs. Well, you're going to see in this video as well. Remember, when Dalsum jumps up to do a drill, Dalsum's, if we see his hitbox right here, it goes way up. So this actually, when I was testing this is not actually that much of a problem. This does not affect Dalsum being able to drill fireballs, right? Because when Dalsum jumps up the beginning of the drill, his hitbox or his hurt box goes up quite substantially. It only matters if Dalsum is like trying to preemptively or guess for a fireball. The fireball can hit him if he's doing that. But if you're actually reacting to fireballs, which isn't an obscure thing to do, you know, it doesn't affect this, right? Now, I want to show some examples of this in video format, right? Let's hopefully that I can pause a little bit. Did you see that right there? So let's say normally Vega's going to do a slide, right? As I showed, Ryu's Dragon Punch. Do you see that right here? Doesn't hit the slide, right? But of course, we don't necessarily want to fix that, right? Because we want to keep Ryu a checking character. That's why Ryu has such powerful checking tools, right? However, let's say we do a red fireball and we saw that we traded, right? Well, what would something happen if we were to change this in like a game, like I said before? Let's hopefully I can pause it at the correct time. See there? Now remember this. Remember this, even though this knocks you down, this does not have a bigger hurt box, right? But that does. That has a bigger hurt box. So that would mean in this situation, you don't trade. Ryu's red fireball would actually beat Vega's slide there, right? Because I would come into contact with his vulnerable hurt box right there before he could hit me, right? So there would be no trade there in a situation like that, right? Again, Vega sliding. Again, see right there, I get hit because that portion of the fireball, again, doesn't hit you, right? It's only when it's actually the shield, right? Then he would be hit. We see right there, right? Instead of then getting hit right there. Even though it's just like a frame or two difference, sometimes a frame or two difference can make a big, well, difference, right? Again, we'll show an example right here. Again, that wouldn't hit, but that would hit. And that would mean that we wouldn't then trade now in this sort of situation. We're keeping the Dragon Punch, right? And you know, who knows? Maybe you might make a character like Ken. Ken's Dragon Punch does hit something like that, right? But Ryu, no. Because I like the idea of that traditional feel of Ryu checking you. Just like, although I think it's fun to have Ryu have a stand short that hits you in your shins, or be able to do a gut kick with his stand medium kick, even though that's fun in its own way, and of course fun is important, that means that we're starting to homogenize characters, and that is something that I don't want to do for a game, right? So let's examples like here, even if we showed the Dalsum example, right? We're talking about slide, right? That would mean that Dalsum gets hit there. Dalsum can't slide that then, right? Because then my shield part of the fireball would hit him, right? Boom. That would mean he would get hit, right? Now, again, you might think that, oh, well, that's too good. But like I said, this doesn't really affect drills when I was like pausing and looking at the hurt boxes and hit boxes, right? See? Let's see if I can try to get a proper little frame here. Because remember, when Dalsum starts the drill, it doesn't really affect him because the first part of the drill goes so high. Let's watch this again. Now remember, that doesn't hit, remember, anyway, but let's see. Again, do you see where his hurt box and hitbox is here? So this doesn't really affect drills. This does not affect like the matchup in terms of Dalsum being able to drill fireballs. Because his hurt box, his vulnerable, already moves up so high, right? Now there are certain situations that it might hit, right? You know, but generally speaking, it only would hit the drill when I was testing if Dalsum is just randomly doing it. But if he's reacting to it, it doesn't matter. Now, a character like Zangief, you might say, oh, this might be too powerful, right? But remember, this doesn't affect Zangief being able to just, you know, lariat through a fireball or anything like that, right? In this sort of situation, when you're up close, yeah, that would hit a lariat, right? And I understand that you might think that that's too powerful because if we think at a situation like this, well, this means that, you know, if I'm just doing a fireball at this distance, right? Well, that means that Zangief just can't lariat through it for free. Again, that might be a nuanced example, but these are three characters that you think generally beat Ryu. And again, I know, again, the Zangief thing, you might be like, oh God, well then there's a range where Zangief can't lariat. Well, remember, I've made videos talking about what I would do for Zangief, and Zangief is not a character that is getting a bad deal of cards, let's say, so to speak, with the EX moves I would give him in the system, right? So another thing that I would probably change for Ryu's Fireball, just because we're talking about it, right? I would make more of a discrepancy of Ryu's Fireballs with the red Fireball and the blue Fireball. I would make the blue Fireball, you know, a much more difference of the speed. Slow is slower and the blue is faster. Whereas red Fireball is a more sort of like slower, medium speed, faster, right? I guess. But blue Fireball is more slow, is quite slow. Hard Punch Fireball is quite fast. I also wouldn't mind something, excuse me, to do something like, say, if you hit with a slow red Fireball and it hit the guy out of the air, it created a juggle point where then the fast Fireball thing could then hit for a juggle. I think that might be kind of fun. But overall, if we can see this right here, what I'm talking about, remember, although boom, 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 all knock you down, we're only changing this. Because if you see this normally, the hurt box on it is only actually just a smidge bigger, right? But I would make it that much bigger, but only for this one. And I think although it is only minuscule, it's only a few frames, right? Sometimes that minuscule difference can make a, well, big difference. And I would like to experiment with that in a game like Super Turbo. And it really only helps him in some of his worst matchups. Like, I don't know, I guess you might say, would it affect a fireball trap, make it harder to jump out of? I mean, maybe in very specific situations. But again, you got to be very close. So if you're at a distance where this is the fireball that's hitting in the fireball trap, you know, I don't know. But again, this is a sort of a perhaps strange example that I don't see talked about very often that I would fiddle with if I was changing Street Fighter. If you like the videos, like, sub, silly comment, share, support the channel if you can. I appreciate it. Thanks.